You ever just know in your bones that someone's petty campaign of harassment is about to backfire on them in the most spectacularly expensive way? I probably don't hold an official world record, but I'd wager I'm in the running for the most systematically demolished mailboxes on a single rural property before I decided enough was gloriously enough. So settle in, maybe grab a drink. This one's a doozy. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Because, folks, the saga of how my humble mailbox went head-to-head with our HOA's self-appointed vehicular enforcer and won is something you truly have to hear to believe. It culminated in his precious patrol truck, looking like it had tried to pick a fight with a miniature steel-reinforced concrete bunker and lost, badly. My little slice of heaven, if you can call 30 acres of Texas scrub and determined mesquite heaven, sits on the edge of what they charmingly call the Ponderosa Pines Ranch Estates. It's less ponderosa, more prickly pear, but the estates part meant we had an HOA. And not just any HOA, but one blessed with Bartholomew Barty Higgins as its president and, more crucially, the commander-in-chief of its Neighborhood Safety and Beautification Committee. Barty was a man whose retirement from middle management at a regional paperclip distribution company had clearly left a power vacuum in his soul, a vacuum he was determined to fill by micromanaging every blade of grass and stray tumbleweed within a 5-mile radius. He was short, perpetually sunburned, and favored khaki cargo shorts that seemed to possess more pockets than strictly necessary for a man whose most dangerous daily expedition was to the community pool. His chariot of choice for enforcing his iron will was a slightly used, surprisingly large Ford F-150, painted an unfortunate shade of municipal beige and adorned with amber flashing lights he'd ordered off the internet. He called it the Community Patrol Vehicle, or CPV, one for short. We called it Barty's Big Beige Battle Wagon. The trouble started subtly, as these things often do. My mailbox, a standard rural type on a sturdy wooden post, was at the end of a long gravel driveway, right where it met the barely paved county road that also served as the main thoroughfare for our estates. One Tuesday, I went to fetch the mail and found the box hanging askew, the door bent, the little red flag snapped clean off, looked like someone had clipped it. Annoying, but these things happen. I'm reasonably handy. You have to be, living out here. So I straightened it up, hammered the door back into a semblance of functionality, and figured that was that. A week later, the whole thing was flattened. Not just clipped, but properly run over. Tire tracks in the soft shoulder told a pretty clear story. This time, I bought a new, slightly more robust model, steel instead of aluminum, and sank the post a good foot deeper, reinforced with a bag of quick-set concrete. That, I figured, should hold it. It held for precisely 9 days. This time, it wasn't just flattened, it looked like someone had taken a baseball bat to it after running it over. The post was splintered, the box itself was a crumpled parallelogram of despair. Now, I was getting suspicious. Mail delivery on our route was handled by a nice lady named Carol in her own trusty Subaru, and she was meticulous. This wasn't her doing. I called the HOA office, which was really just Barty's garage extension, and left a message. Barty himself called back, his voice oozing a sort of insincere sympathy that set my teeth on edge. "Terrible shame about that, son," he drawled, despite me being a good decade his senior. "Lots of reckless drivers on these country roads. Probably some teenagers joyriding. We're doing our best with the CPV one to maintain vigilance." Of course. He then segued into a 15-minute lecture about the importance of property upkeep and how a damaged mailbox reflected poorly on the entire Ponderosa Pines community. The irony was apparently lost on him. I replaced it again. Standard metal box, wooden post. I wasn't going to go crazy yet. This was Mailbox version 3. It lasted a whole 2 weeks, a new record. This time, alongside the now familiar tire tracks, there was a small, almost imperceptible smear of beige paint on the mangled metal. Beige, like Barty's Big Beige Battle Wagon. My blood pressure, normally as placid as a sleeping hound dog, started to do a little two-step. This wasn't teenagers, this wasn't random, this felt personal. I started keeping a log. Dates, times of discovery, photos of the damage. I even took photos of the tire tracks next to a ruler. My wife, bless her patient heart, just shook her head and said, Don't let him get to you, dear. He's just a sad little man with a big truck. Wise words. But the part of me that had spent years designing and stress-testing industrial components for a living was starting to view this less as an annoyance and more as an engineering challenge with a particularly irritating human variable. Barty Higgins had no idea who he was messing with. He just saw a rancher who needed to keep his mailbox off the ground. He didn't see the simmering rage of a detail-oriented man who really disliked bullies. The game, as they say, was afoot, though Barty was the only one who didn't seem to realize he was about to play. The fourth mailbox met its demise on a bright Thursday morning. This one was particularly brutal. It looked like it had been reversed over, then driven over again for good measure. The beige paint smear was more obvious this time, accompanied by a tiny chip of what looked suspiciously like plastic from a fender flare. I took my photos, bagged the paint chip like a CSI detective, and felt a cold, calm anger settle in. Polite phone calls clearly weren't working. Passive resistance, in the form of replacing mailboxes he could easily destroy, was just encouraging him. It was time to escalate, but on my terms. I decided a little reconnaissance was in order. I remembered a cheap wildlife camera I'd bought a few years back, intending to see what critters were raiding my vegetable garden. Turned out to be raccoons with a surprising aptitude for opening latches. The battery life was terrible, and the picture quality was akin to viewing the world through a dirty sock, but it might be enough. I strapped it to a mesquite tree across the road, angled vaguely towards my mailbox post, camouflaged it with some dead branches, and hoped for the best. A week later, I retrieved the SD card, my expectations low. Most of the footage was of waving grass, startled deer, and Carol faithfully delivering the mail. But then, there it was. Grainy, jerky, and partially obscured by a rogue tumbleweed that had decided to photobomb the scene, but unmistakably Barty's big beige battle wagon. It didn't show the impact itself. The camera's trigger speed was too slow for that. But it showed the truck swerving aggressively towards my side of the road, right where the mailbox used to be. This was between Mailbox 3's destruction and before I'd put up a temporary plastic one. Then, a few frames later, it showed the truck continuing on its merry way, the driver's side uncomfortably close to where the mailbox post would have been. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a very smoky cap pistol. It was enough to confirm my suspicions that this wasn't just aggressive driving, this was targeted. He was deliberately hugging the edge of the road, maybe even veering onto the shoulder to take out my mailboxes. Why? Spite? A bizarre sense of power? Or maybe he just really hated my choice of mailbox color. Armed with this new, albeit blurry, evidence, I decided a face-to-face was in order. I found Barty holding court by the community notice board, lecturing a bewildered-looking retiree about the correct shade of beige for painting her garden gnomes. "Barty," I said, holding up my phone with the video cued, "we need to talk about my mailbox." He squinted at the screen, his face clouding over. "What's this supposed to be?" he huffed. "Looks like a truck driving down a road, perfectly normal." I pointed to the timestamp and the aggressive swerve. "This is your truck, Barty, right around the time my third mailbox was destroyed. And it looks like you're deliberately aiming for it." Barty puffed himself up, his face turning a shade redder than his usual sunburn. "Now you listen here. I resent that accusation. That road is narrow. Maybe if your mailbox wasn't practically in the middle of the lane, it wouldn't get hit. It's probably so flimsy, a strong gust of wind could knock it over." He then launched into a tirade about how I was clearly trying to cause trouble, how my property was an eyesore, it wasn't, and how my unsubstantiated allegations were slanderous. He dismissed the video as inconclusive garbage and warned me about making false reports. As I walked away, his parting shot echoed in my ears. "Maybe if your mailbox wasn't so flimsy." Flimsy! The word hung in the air. An idea, cold and beautiful and utterly devious, began to crystallize in my mind. If Barty Higgins wanted to wage war on my mailboxes, then by God, he was going to get a battle. He thought they were flimsy? Oh, I'd show him flimsy. My mind, accustomed to solving problems involving stress tolerances and material strengths, began to churn. I wasn't just going to build a stronger mailbox. I was going to build a monument to malicious compliance. a steel and concrete middle finger disguised as a mail receptacle. I went home and pulled out an old drafting pad. The Ponderosa Pines Property Owners Association had bylaws thicker than a phone book for a small city, covering everything from acceptable pet breeds to the precise Pantone color of exterior paint. I'd read them cover to cover when I first moved in, mostly out of morbid curiosity. I vaguely recalled a section on mailboxes. I dug out the binder and found it. Mailboxes must conform to United States Postal Service regulations for size, height, and accessibility. Mailboxes and supporting posts must be kept in good repair and present a neat appearance. Not a single word about maximum structural integrity, not a whisper about what they couldn't be made of. An evil grin spread across my face. Barty, you magnificent buffoon, you have no idea what you've just initiated. This wasn't just about a mailbox anymore, this was about principle. And a little bit about the sheer, unadulterated joy of watching an arrogant man hoist himself by his own petard, or, in this case, ram himself on his own perceived victim. The first step was research, and I don't mean just the HOA bylaws. I delved into the USPS Postal Operations Manual, specifically Section D41, Customer Mail Receptacles. It detailed height requirements, 41 to 45 inches from the road surface to the bottom of the mailbox or point of mail entry, setback, 6 to 8 inches from the curb or road edge, and structural recommendations. Posts should be sturdy but designed to yield or break away if struck by a vehicle to prevent serious injury. Ah, there was the rub. Yield or break away. That was the spirit of the law, designed for safety. But the letter of the law, it didn't forbid something stronger, especially on a rural route with no curbs and a wide shoulder like mine. It was a recommendation, not an ironclad mandate enforced by federal mailbox police. And Barty wasn't exactly adhering to the avoid striking mailboxes part of road safety, was he? I decided to interpret sturdy in its most robust sense. My wife found me one evening surrounded by sketches of what looked less like a mailbox and more like a defensive emplacement. "What in tarnation are you building now?" she asked, peering over my shoulder. "That, my dear," I said, tapping a particularly beefy-looking cross-section, "is the Higgins Mark IV Indestructible Mail Delivery System. Or, as I like to call it, Barty's Bane. My background isn't in engineering, not formally anyway, but I've spent a lifetime on ranches and farms, fixing machinery, welding broken gates, and generally figuring out how to make things strong enough to withstand abuse from livestock, weather, and occasionally sheer stupidity. I knew my way around a stick welder and had a decent collection of steel scraps. My plan was devious in its simplicity. The core would be a 6-inch diameter steel well casing pipe, the kind designed to be pounded deep into the earth. I had a 10-foot section of it left over from a water project years ago. This pipe would be sunk a good 4 feet into the ground, encased in an unholy amount of concrete. We're talking a cubic yard, maybe more. The mailbox itself would be a heavy-gauge steel box, nothing too outlandish looking from the outside, but internally reinforced with steel bars and welded directly to a thick steel plate, which in turn would be welded to the top of the aforementioned well casing. The critical part was making it look like just another sturdy rural mailbox, perhaps a bit overbuilt by a determined rancher, but not like the vehicular man-trap it was designed to be. No spikes, no sharpened edges, just uncompromising solidity. I even planned to paint it a very standard, unassuming black, just like Mailbox 3. I discussed my plan with my neighbor, old Jed, a retired trucker who'd seen his share of road hazards and had no love for Barty Higgins. Jed had once received an HOA violation notice because his prize-winning zinnias were, according to Barty, non-compliant with the approved Ponderosa Pines floral palette. Jed listened to my plan, a slow grin spreading across his weathered face. "Son," he said, clapping me on the shoulder, "that's not just a mailbox, that's a work of art. You make sure you call me when you install it. I want to see this." His enthusiasm was infectious. The next Saturday, I rented a powered auger. Digging a 4-foot-deep, 18-inch wide hole in the caliche-ridden Texas soil by hand would have taken me a week and several chiropractors. With the auger, it was merely a grueling, sweat-soaked morning. Then came the concrete. I bought 20 80-pound bags. The checkout girl at the hardware store looked at me like I was planning to build a new wing on my house. "Big project?" she asked. "Just reinforcing a mailbox," I replied, with a perfectly straight face. She blinked. I think she suspected I was starting a cult. Mixing that much concrete by hand in a wheelbarrow was an exercise in Sisyphean torment, but the thought of Barty's face when his truck connected with my creation spurred me on. Each shovelful of gravel, each glug of water, felt like a small act of defiance. By sunset, the massive steel pipe was planted firmly in a tomb of solid rock, plumb and true. It looked less like a mailbox post and more like the anchor point for a suspension bridge. I let the concrete cure for a full week, watering it occasionally like a precious, if somewhat phallic, new plant. The final assembly was almost ceremonial. I'd fabricated the mailbox itself in my workshop, reinforcing a standard heavy-duty rural box with interior steel ribs, welding the seams, and fitting a robust piano hinge for the door. The flag was made from quarter-inch steel plate. It wouldn't be snapping off. I welded this fortified box onto a thick steel mounting plate, which I then meticulously welded to the top of the massive pipe. The welds weren't pretty. I'm a functional welder, not an artist, but they were strong. Penetration was excellent. That box wasn't going anywhere short of a direct hit from an anti-tank missile. I ground down the rough spots, then applied 2 coats of rust-inhibiting primer and 2 coats of satin black enamel. It looked substantial, very, very substantial. But still, from a distance, just like a black mailbox on a thick post. Once it was installed, I stood back to admire my handiwork. It was exactly 42 inches to the bottom of the box and set back 7 inches from the road edge. Perfectly USPS compliant. I even called Martha, our local postmistress, a no-nonsense woman who had seen it all. I explained I'd had some trouble with vandalism and had installed a very sturdy replacement and just wanted to make sure it was okay for Carol. Martha drove out herself. She took one look at it, poked it with her finger, then tried to give it a shake. It didn't budge, not a millimeter. She looked at me, a tiny smile playing on her lips. "Well," she said, "nobody's going to be stealing that one, or knocking it over by accident. Carol will be fine with it." She knew. I think everyone in our small community, except perhaps Barty himself, knew what was going on. The air was thick with anticipation. I reinstalled my wildlife camera, now upgraded to a newer model with better resolution and faster trigger speed, and added a second one pointing down the road to capture the approach. I made sure they were visible. Let Barty know he was being watched. Let him think twice, or preferably not at all. The new mailbox, which I'd mentally dubbed the Unyielding Sentinel, stood its ground for a full 10 days without incident. Barty's big beige battle wagon drove past it numerous times. I saw him slow down on occasion, craning his neck to get a better look. I imagined him squinting, perhaps a flicker of confusion in his eyes, at the sheer immovability of it. Once he even stopped when I was out front, pretending to weed a flower bed. He leaned out his window, a smirk playing on his lips. "Well, well, another new mailbox, I see," he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Going for a more robust model this time, are we? Let's see how long this one lasts against the elements." "The elements, right." I just smiled benignly. "Trying something different, Barty." "Hoping for the best." He chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound, and drove off, the amber lights on his roof giving a jaunty flash as if to punctuate his perceived cleverness. The sheer arrogance of the man was breathtaking. He was so convinced of his own petty dominance, so sure that his campaign of attrition would eventually break me, that he couldn't conceive of a scenario where his actions might have actual, physical consequences for him. During this waiting period, the HOA grapevine was buzzing. My neighbor Jed had, with a conspiratorial wink, spread the word about my special project. There were knowing glances at the monthly Ponderosa Pines potluck. A slight uptick in friendly waves from folks who'd previously kept to themselves. It seemed Barty's reign of minor terror had chafed more than a few residents. At one particularly tedious HOA meeting, called to discuss the pressing issue of unauthorized wind chimes, Barty spent a good 10 minutes on a tangent about maintaining the aesthetic integrity of our verges and the importance of swiftly addressing any property deficiencies that detract from our community standards. He kept glancing. in my direction. I just sat there, looking as placid as a man contemplating the inevitable collision of an unstoppable force, my mailbox, with a highly movable and eminently damageable object, Barty's truck. Some of the other board members, a collection of mostly well-meaning but thoroughly cowed individuals whom Barty had handpicked for their pliability, nodded along dutifully. They were the enablers, the ones who, through inaction or quiet assent, allowed Barty's little fiefdom to flourish. They saw his behavior, heard the grumbles, but chose the path of least resistance. Little did they know. Resistance was coming, 4 feet deep in concrete and topped with half-inch steel plate. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for the rat to come for the cheese. And Barty Higgins was nothing if not predictable in his appetites for petty destruction. The quiet before the storm was almost deafening. The day of reckoning dawned bright and clear, a typically scorching Texas Tuesday. I decided to spend the morning tidying up the landscaping around the base of the unyielding Sentinel. This involved a lot of leaning on a rake, sipping iced tea, and discreetly checking the angles on my 2 strategically placed cameras. My wife thought I was nuts sitting out there in the heat, but she also had a small, anticipatory smile on her face. She'd packed me an extra-large thermos. Around 10:30 a.m., the familiar rumble of Barty's F-150 echoed down the road. Showtime. He was doing his usual mid-morning patrol, probably on his way to harass someone about the length of their grass or the non-regulation color of their petunias. I made myself look busy, head down, pretending to be engrossed in a particularly stubborn patch of crabgrass. I could hear him coming, the crunch of gravel under his oversized tires. He wasn't going fast, maybe 15-20 miles per hour, his usual cruising speed when he was on the lookout for infractions. Perfect. Through my peripheral vision, I saw the beige behemoth approach, and then, just as he'd done countless times before with my lesser mailboxes, Barty made his signature move. A casual, almost lazy drift to the right, the passenger side tires biting into the soft shoulder. He was probably looking at his clipboard of violations, or maybe texting, the picture of distracted entitlement. He clearly expected Mailbox 5 to offer no more resistance than its flimsy predecessors. A satisfying thwack, a flutter of mangled metal in his rearview mirror, another victory for order and conformity. What he got was something entirely different. Instead of a thwack, there was a sound like a dump truck hitting a concrete barricade. A sickening, metallic crunch thump that echoed across the quiet landscape, followed almost instantaneously by the loud thump of an airbag deploying. The big beige battle wagon lurched violently, its front passenger side corner collapsing inwards as if punched by an invisible giant. The truck slewed to a halt, steam hissing from under the buckled hood. And the unyielding Sentinel, it stood there, unmoved, unbent, possibly with a fresh microscopic scratch on its black paint, but otherwise utterly indifferent to the chaos it had just wrought. I dropped my rake, a suitably shocked expression plastered on my face, though internally I was doing a victory lap worthy of an Olympian, and started a brisk walk towards the stricken vehicle. Barty was just climbing out, looking dazed. The airbag had clearly done its job, leaving a powdery residue on his khaki shirt and a stunned, almost comical expression on his face. He clutched his shoulder, his jaw slack, then his eyes focused on his truck's crumpled fender, the shattered headlight, the wheel now sitting at a very unnatural angle. Then he looked at my mailbox. Then back at his truck. The cogs were turning, slowly, painfully. His face went from stunned to confused, then to a deep, apoplectic crimson. "What in the Sam Hill?" he sputtered, finally finding his voice. "What did you do?" I arrived, pulling out my phone and hitting record on the video camera, a habit I developed thanks to him. "Everything all right there, Barty?" I asked, my voice a perfect blend of concern and feigned surprise. "Looks like you've had a bit of a mishap. Did you hit my mailbox?" Barty rounded on me, his face contorted with rage. "Your mailbox? Your mailbox? That thing you put there? It's a hazard. It's a damn weapon. You did this deliberately to damage my vehicle. I'll have you arrested. I'll sue you for everything you've got." He was practically dancing with fury, waving his arms. "Now hold on, Barty," I said calmly, keeping the phone trained on him. "This is a standard USPS-compliant mailbox. Been here for nearly 2 weeks now. Solid, sure, because I was tired of it getting vandalized. but it's just sitting there on my property, minding its own business. You're the one who drove into it. I gestured to the clear tire tracks leading directly from the road, onto the shoulder, and into the immovable object. And I've got to say, Barty, this isn't the first time you've come a little too close. I have footage. His eyes widened slightly at the mention of more footage. Several neighbors, drawn by the tremendous bang, were starting to wander down their driveways, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and poorly concealed amusement. Old Jed was ambling over, a massive grin splitting his face. The public humiliation phase was commencing right on schedule. Barty looked from my impassive mailbox, to his crippled truck, to the gathering audience, and he seemed to deflate just a little. The bluster was still there, but it was tinged with the dawning, horrified realization that he had massively, catastrophically miscalculated. The arrival of Deputy Miller from the county sheriff's office was almost anticlimactic. Barty, in a last-ditch attempt to regain control, had bellowed into his phone for law enforcement, claiming he'd been the victim of a booby-trapped stationary object. Deputy Miller, a young woman with a calm demeanor and eyes that had clearly seen their share of rural absurdities, listened patiently to Barty's increasingly frantic and contradictory account. He claimed I'd suddenly installed an illegal reinforced hazard, then that it was camouflaged to cause damage, then that I'd somehow lured him into it. I simply presented my side. It was a mailbox on my property, meeting all USPS regulations, and I had footage of him hitting it, as well as footage suggesting a pattern of him destroying previous, flimsier mailboxes. I offered to show her the videos. Miller walked over to the unyielding Sentinel, gave it a cursory inspection, measured its height and setback with a tape measure from her cruiser, and then looked at the deep, undeniable gouge in Barty's truck. She consulted her notepad. "Well, Mr. Higgins," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "as far as I can tell, this is a single-vehicle accident. You appear to have failed to maintain your lane and struck a stationary object. The mailbox itself seems to be compliant with postal regulations and properly cited." Barty started to sputter again, but she cut him off. "You're free to file a complaint if you believe there's more to it, but from what I see here, the fault lies with the driver of the vehicle." She then proceeded to write Barty a ticket for failure to control his vehicle. The sight of Barty Higgins, HOA president and self-styled guardian of Ponderosa Pines, being handed a traffic citation next to his mangled CPV-1 and my indomitable mailbox was a balm to my soul. The HOA emergency board meeting was convened 2 days later. Word of Barty's folly had spread like wildfire. I wasn't invited naturally, but Jed, who had a friend on the board, one of the quieter, more sensible ones, gave me a full report. Barty apparently tried to spin a wild tale of my aggressive and unneighborly installation of a dangerous device. He demanded the HOA pay for his truck repairs and take legal action against me to have the menace removed. That's when my carefully curated package arrived, delivered by courier to each board member just before the meeting. It contained printouts of the photos of all 4 previously destroyed mailboxes, with dates and times, a USB drive with the grainy footage of his truck swerving at mailbox 3, a crystal-clear video of him striking the unyielding Sentinel, complete with his enraged, incriminating outburst afterwards, a copy of the USPS regulations, and a polite but firm letter from my lawyer, a cousin who owed me a favor and specialized in property disputes, outlining my rights and suggesting that any further harassment or attempts to force removal of my perfectly legal mailbox would be met with vigorous legal counteraction. According to Jed, the mood in the room shifted dramatically. Barty's bluster deflated like a punctured tire. The smoking gun wasn't just the final crash video. It was the whole meticulously documented pattern of behavior. The board, faced with undeniable evidence of Barty's reckless vendetta and the potential for a costly lawsuit if they backed him, did the only sensible thing. They voted to table any discussion of my mailbox indefinitely. They also informed Barty that the HOA's insurance would not be covering damage to the CPV-1 caused by his own negligent actions while on a personal crusade, nor would they be funding his legal battles against me. The truck, it turned out, was his personal vehicle, merely adorned with HOA-funded magnetic signs and lights. He was on his own. The fallout was swift and satisfying. Barty had to pay for the extensive repairs to his big beige battle wagon out of his own pocket. I heard it was several $1,000s. He was quietly removed as head of the Neighborhood Safety and Beautification Committee, the position going to a mild-mannered retired botanist who was more interested in actual beautification than vehicular intimidation. At the next annual HOA election, Barty didn't even run for the board. He seemed to have lost his appetite for public service, or perhaps just public humiliation. The unyielding sentinel became something of a local legend. People would slow down as they drove past, sometimes pointing. A few even stopped to take pictures. Carol, my mail lady, always gave it a cheerful pat as she deposited the mail. She told me it was the most talked-about mailbox on her entire route. My life returned to its previous quieter rhythm, punctuated only by the gentle clink of mail hitting the reinforced steel of Barty's bane. The piece was beautiful. Looking back, the whole affair was a masterclass in the absurdity of petty tyranny. Barty, in his quest for absolute control over his tiny domain, had picked a fight with the one thing he couldn't bully into submission, a well-engineered piece of steel backed by an equally stubborn owner. He'd consistently underestimated me, seeing only a target for his frustrations, not someone capable of methodical planning and execution. His own rules, or lack thereof regarding mailbox construction, became his undoing. It's a classic case of the biter bit, and the schadenfreude was, I admit, delicious. The Ponderosa Pines Ranch Estates became a slightly more relaxed place to live. The new Neighborhood Safety Committee actually focused on safety, like trimming overgrown bushes at intersections, rather than waging war on mailboxes. Sometimes, to solve a problem, you don't need to argue or plead. Sometimes, you just need to build a better, stronger, and far more satisfying solution. So, what's the craziest HOA encounter you've ever had, or what's the most creative solution you've come up with for a neighborhood nuisance? Drop your stories in the comments below. I'd love to read them. And if you enjoyed this little tale of metallic justice, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of when people pushed too far and finally got exactly what they deserved.